What's up, everybody? Peter Exodus Okafor here, and welcome to another episode of the Classic Rock Podcast. In this podcast, I've been doing this episode. I'm going to move beyond the the reasons why classic rock has declined, and start examining how and if there can be a re-emergence of classic rock. I'm going to start off by Rolling Stone now has their own podcast. It's called Rolling Stone Music Now, and they have a couple of podcasts on the demise of classic rock as well. So let's jump into that. So Rolling Stone Music Now. So 3 episodes that deal with the demise of classic rock. The first one would have taken place February 13th, 2017, is Rock Dead, an Intense Debate. The second one would be The Long Life and Slow Death of Classic Rock, and that was May 8th, 2018. And I believe this is when Stephen Hayden was on. He's done a memoir of his love of classic rock called Twilight of the Gods. And Stephen Hayden was on 2 of these. And then the final one is they talk about Who's Next by The Who and Led Zeppelin 4. And looking back at classic rock, and that would have been August 25th, 2021. Now, the interesting thing is the host and these folks are younger Gen Xers. So they kind of came of age into music in the early 90s. So they were fans of classic rock, but they were also discovering music when Nirvana and grunge was the thing in the early 90s. So that's an interesting kind of coming of age story. So they're a little different from me and have a little different perspective. Interestingly, they talked about reading the fiction. The early 80s is when the bios, not fiction, but turns out some of it was fiction, but the bios on these big classic rock groups from the era. And we're talking Hammer of the Gods by Led Zeppelin and No One Gets Out of Here Alive on the Doors. And of course, those have been picked apart, and Stephen Hayden, the author of Twilight of the Gods, talks about how, these rock stars almost become superheroes in the stories, and I want to be like these guys. And so, I skipped that phase because by the time those books hit the market, I was into the music, but of Zeppelin and the Doors, but I was not at that. I had no desire to read bios on them. So one of the interesting arguments that they make, and the host, I can't remember his name, makes about classic rock is that it was essentially a construct, a radio format, and, it didn't exist before the early 80s. Well, it came out of album-oriented rock, and album-oriented rock, and they changed the name. It existed, and, classic rock is it's shaped by baby boomers, but album-oriented rock, I started getting into classic rock in the late 70s, and it was the same thing as classic rock in the early, in the early 80s when they changed the name of it. But it is a baby boomer construct. It's the music they loved. These younger Gen Xers have a much broader definition of rock than baby boomers. So they talk about Motown and Parliament Funkadelic and even James Brown. And I mean that, they're in the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame. Those Motown, influenced the rock groups, but that's not, that, boomers don't consider that classic rock, and classic rock is a very, other than Thin Lizzy and Hendrix, it's very white and predominantly male. So I sort of disagree with, that classic rock is a myth. I mean, there are strands. I mean, you have the arena rock of Journey and Foreigner. You have, Kiss and Aerosmith from the 70s. You have the Beatles and the Stones. But they do make a good demarcation with the Beatles. So you have the Beatles Revolver on is classic rock, and the, before Revolver is oldies. And, I think they called it the Mop Top era of the Beatles. So yeah, it is interesting. Yeah, but I don't know. It's not a mythology. I mean, again, you have progressive rock, as part of this. Genesis and Pink Floyd, and then you have Journey and Foreigner and REO Speedwagon from arena rock, and then you have, then you get Aerosmith and Kiss and AC/DC, which most people, would say, hard rock. And then you get the Eagles and Fleetwood Mac, Fleetwood, pop rock sort of. So that's all under the umbrella. We know who they are. We know the different subcategories of it. It's not, this is the music that, boomers listen to. And this is how it's marketed under classic rock. I mean, it's not a construct. There are, it's not a myth. There are strands there. And boomers didn't think, James Brown and Motown and one thing all the groups I just named, have in common, their guitars. Now, classic rock and AOR, they played Elton John and Billy Joel too. But is it guitar based? No, but somehow they were able to slip in there and become part of classic rock. Now, in the 90s and the 80s, Billy Joel becomes pop. And but it's interesting how, so, yeah, how did Elton John and Billy Joel get into classic rock? What happened? And then Springsteen, yeah, it was guitar, but it was pretty heavily, keyboard there for Springsteen as well. So, yeah, interesting. They have an interesting take on classic rock. So a couple interesting, on these 3 episodes coming out of Rolling Stone. In the 90s, country rock took over the territory of what you called Heartland rock. So think Heartland rock, think John Mellencamp, Tom Petty, and Bruce Springsteen. Yeah, that happened. Billy Ray Cyrus. What's the guy? He sold all kinds of stuff. It's slipping my mind right now. One of the biggest artists of the 90s, country act. It'll come back. Yeah, Garth Brooks. That's who I was thinking of. So Garth Brooks kind of took, the Heartland rock. The other thing, and I've touched on this, and they reiterated, but the spirit of rock has gone into other genres, particularly hip-hop. The rebelliousness that folks liked about classic rock is now in hip-hop, and hip-hop does it better. Elements of funk, the fat bass, the danceability, the coolness, that's also gone into hip-hop. So, that's kind of what happens. So they asked the question, will there ever be another, like a guitar-based act as big as Taylor Swift and Beyonce? And they don't answer the question, they pose it. And you got to deal with this later, will it happen? I don't know. Is it possible? Yeah, because there's things, as I said in other episodes, that classic rock does that, and that soul and funk do that other, these newer genres don't do as well. The other thing they touch on is it's hard for newer classic rock acts to get airplay because, classic rock is not going to play newer acts. They also talked to another issue that Rick Beato kind of, spoke to on classic rock, and that is today, music acts are more individual centric. So I mean, Taylor Swift, Beyonce, and classic rock was a group centric thing. So I mean, name some. I mean, you had Billy Squier, you had Sammy Hagar, but most people know Sammy Hagar from Van Halen. So that's another thing. And of course, I mean, a lot of that happened, focused on individuals is because of the whole branding aspect. It also takes, they mention this, and Rick Beato covers on this, and Punk Rock MBA, record companies have to invest a lot more time and energy into rock acts. It takes longer for them to break. And then they kind of close with a very interesting thing, and that is classic rock is rooted in nostalgia. And that classic rock, honors the past, but makes that past, music relevant in the present. And that stopped. They talk about the Rolling Stones and the Keith Richards, Mick Jagger dichotomy and the tension that made the Stones so good. Because, if Keith had his way, they would just do, 40s, 50s blues. And Mick was always like, well, let's try some new things and make it relevant to today. That might be one of the problems because, these younger generations, I mean, millennials and Gen Z are selective when it comes to nostalgia. And, when it comes to, black folks, African Americans in general, they're not very nostalgic at all when it comes to older music. I mean, go on, Spotify and look at the streaming numbers for the classic rock era. I mean, you're lucky if songs are getting 40 million streams. I mean, they're not even getting close to a billion. They're not even getting 100 million streams. And so, we've always the black community's always had that where they just kind of drop, younger generations drop, their parents' music and move on and in some ways, forget it. I mean, the classic rock did not do that with funk. But funk was that good and they couldn't. I mean, and that's why, the roots of hip hop are still in funk. The other interesting thing I think they make is they talk about the youth. So the 80s and 90s, the Doors were the big thing. And today now you're seeing Nirvana and Pink Floyd are the big things. I mean, regardless of race, looking at younger millennials and Gen Z. And, I follow some of the, on Instagram, some of these younger celebrities. And, you see a lot of Nirvana and Pink Floyd t-shirts. So that's kind of, I mean, Kurt Cobain is the new Jim Morrison, but it's interesting. Yeah, so just to wrap up the Rolling Stones stuff, different perspective, younger Gen Xers looking at classic rock. They didn't take classic rock as seriously, obviously, as boomers and, older Gen Xers like myself, because, in some ways they say, they call some of it cartoonish, which obviously wouldn't sit well with a lot of boomers. But, but it's a different perspective. And of course, I mean, they're coming of age in music when, grunge is hitting, and grunge was took the best elements of classic rock, but also had a pretty hard critique of classic rock, and when it comes to gender and politics and stuff, these younger Gen Xers kind of internalized that critique. So that question, going back to the question they asked, will we see a guitar-based act that's as big as Taylor Swift or Beyonce? Maybe. Uh, Certainly, I mean, it's interesting. It's very, if there's a class system in the music ecosystem now, it's mostly, working class at best. I mean, Beyonce and Drake and Ariana Grande and Taylor Swift are up there, and there's not a big middle class. So, when it comes to the music ecosystem where people fall, I don't know if you could, if classic rock will ever get into that superstar ecosystem. They make the point though that, who has the biggest tours, if you look at the 10 biggest tours every year, there's still a lot of classic rock acts in that. But, boomers have a lot of money too, retirement and the great economies, they had, while they worked. As we get into the acceleration of change and technology and how it affects jobs, who knows what the future holds for younger generations. But yeah, so but let's look. I mean, what will have to happen for classic rock to make a comeback? Now, I've said this before, and I think what classic rock and funk and R&B, soul from the 70s and 80s and, early 90s does better than any of these current generations, so you can really get a good slice of life. I mean, you can get the emotions and the full spectrum of life as an artist and put it out there. I mean, punk is all rebellion, and life isn't, there's obviously, we all have rebellious things and, that part of ourselves, but that's not everything. I mean, those three genres I just mentioned, I mean, you can, there's romance, there's anger, there could be politics, there can be loss, there could be, and all those three genres also, really focused on the emotional aspects and the mood of music, in addition to the hooks. Hip hop is, dance, and it's, focuses on the streets, and it's, it can be pretty political, can be sexually explicit, but, there ain't a lot of love ballads in hip hop. There ain't a lot of, pop punk tries, romance. I don't know how successful it is. I've never heard one that really grabs me. So this is the kind of stuff I think where, there's that opportunity there for classic rock. So, but what gets me, and I did a whole episode on this podcast, the Classic Rock podcast on the soul of the guitar. And, the rock bands they trying to break through, they just have really bad, boring rhythm guitar in the tone. But there's a way around that. It's interesting because I just literally in the last day or two ran across Slash from Guns N' Roses, and he was talking about the dying art of miking up amplifiers, using a Shure SM57 mic to amp, the guitar amp to send it in on the track. That's how Hendrix and the Stones, that's how they did in the 70s and 80s. Now, it's not a bad thing, but now you have, computer programs that will, we call them virtual simulated instruments essentially, but with effects too. So you can go in there and play around and find a Marshall amp or a Vox amp and this distortion pedal or that wah-wah pedal and start marrying them up and get your own tone. There's also been a couple VSTs rumored out there. I've never been able to find them, where you could, type in a song and then the pedal and amp settings would come up and they would have them. That would be great. It's sort of an AI thing. And probably I've seen, things, in the last 2 or 3 years, these programs saying they could do that. And then they probably overpromised because they've disappeared, because I've Googled again and I can't find them. But with the advances that AI is making, that's not a bad tool to have that can really, get some interesting mood and tone back into. Because that's really what made classic rock, is the rhythm guitar and the mood and the tones you could get with the effects. But now, with the DAWs, digital audio workstations, they, GarageBand and they have, you can go in there and they probably have 15 to 20 different amps you could, click and marry them up with different, pedals and get a sound like that. So, it's experimentation. It's not, it used to be you had to buy the pedals. And I know, some boomer musicians will say, oh, they're not the same. They're not the same. You need the actual hardware. When you put it in a mix, it doesn't really, no one's going to tell the difference. Yeah. I mean, if you put a guitar through a virtual, Boss distortion pedal into, a Marshall amp, the real thing and the virtual, recreation, yeah, it's going to sound a little different. But when you put it in a song and mix it and do all that other, the essence of that's still going to come out. So, yeah, so I mean, but there just doesn't seem the interest, as far as musicians to do to do stuff like classic rock. So that's part of it. I do think, and it's the mood and the tone that makes, classic rock special and unique. The second thing you can do is you can use synthesizers to set that mood as well. Pink Floyd did an amazing job with Rick Wright. I mean, David Gilmour, the guitarist, and Rick Wright, the keyboards. I mean, they had a beautiful relationship and they played off of each other. And that's Pink Floyd is Pink Floyd because of those two. Because you think of Comfortably Numb and all their great songs. I mean, that was the mood and Rick Wright and David Gilmour working together. Rush, another great one who used synthesizers very well. Then you got, Bon Jovi, that pop rock thing, but they use synthesizers well, but they use them for the hooks, whereas, Pink Floyd and, Rush used them to paint a picture and to set a mood. Either way, it worked. And the other thing when it comes to this whole aspect of setting the mood is, your guitars, you can, mess around and come up with your own tone. I mean, there's two schools of thought when it comes to guitarists. One is learn as many different, tones as you can, like Jimi Hendrix, and use them for different songs. The other one, there's a lot of guitarists who spend a lot of time doing this, and then, it's a trade secret, is get your own unique tone and roll with it. Eddie Van Halen. Eddie had his own tone. I mean, the minute, a Van Halen song came on, you recognized Eddie's tone, you knew it was his, and you spent a lot of time and, hired some very, and paid a lot of money to guitar techs to get a consistent tone that was, uniquely his. So that's the other thing is, get your own unique tone and supplement it with synthesizers. Or, again, jump in with these virtual effects and play around. You don't have to buy them anymore. They're in your digital audio workstation, whether it's Pro Tools or GarageBand or Logic Pro or, FL Studio. hey, go in there and mess around and come up with something. The other thing too is, just start making music, have a longer view of it. The things that the strength, I mean, I don't think classic rock is a young person's genre anymore. Hip hop is. Because hip hop, the rebellion and the energy and all that stuff, that's, hip hop does that, and will always do that better than classic rock. I mean, the contemplative stuff that you get later with Clapton and Pink Floyd, that's where and sometimes as growth as an adult, that doesn't come along until your 30s, so, and your 40s. So it might take a while, to, on that journey, but if you love classic rock, I mean, roll with it and, but use all the colors in the palette, as a painter and be patient and talk about those things that we all experience. I mean, classic rock and soul and funk is more like being a novelist than taking a sliver of the human experience and doubling down like, hip hop and punk does. And finally, classic rock along with funk and then even soul, I mean, you can get experimental. I mean, punk being experimental was never about it's pure energy, it's pure rebellion. Yeah, I mean, there's definitely experimental acts in hip hop, but you got Genesis, you got Steely Dan, you got Pink Floyd. I mean, you got Rush. They were experimental. They did different things. So there's that aspect of classic rock too, that hip hop shares. Now, you make a ton of money doing it, the experimental hip hop acts, are they, at a billion streams? No, but it's there. So, yeah. So the question will, I think, classic rock will come back in some form. It'll probably land in the middle. Maybe, lands there, in the working class, but you get a good following. The other thing too that classic rock brings is the live aspect. I mean, you're never gonna have a DJ doing classic rock. I mean, it will be people playing instruments, and that's a novelty. And I think there's particularly a whole avenue out there for the jam band experience. And at some point, I'm going to do an episode on jam bands. Starting with the first jam band, the Doors, but Grateful Dead, famous for being a jam band. But P-Funk, George Clinton. I mean, they're essentially a jam band, and that tradition is not going away. There's a whole young generation of jam bands and party bands out there that will endure. And there's still even with younger folks, even with Gen Z and younger millennials, they want to see actual live music without a DJ. So you have to take advantage of that. The one thing with jam bands, and I know, I'll get into this more when I do the episode somewhere down the road, but they're not the best when it comes to hooks, and they're not the best, when it comes to mood. A lot of these groups aren't with labels. They're independent like myself. So my thing is like, roll with your strength and go straight to releasing live albums. That's my thing. That's, and I think, jam bands will thrive when they start doing that. I mean, play to your strengths when it comes to branding. Let folks hear you. And, because, with a jam band, no performance is ever the same. It's a little bit like jazz, they stretch the songs out and, there's a general direction and a general map, but it's different. So, yeah, so I'll leave on that note. But yeah, I had fun with this episode, and love my classic rock. Don't care what anybody says, and it'll morph into something else. The blues is a thriving, working class genre right now. And I think, classic rock will come because it does things that other genres currently are doing. So anyway, thanks for coming through. Hit the like button. Subscribe to the channel. I have 5 albums hooked to this channel and also on the streaming services. Come to find out, I'm not the only Exodus out there. So my first album is Book 1. So look for that and what's connected with that. If you're interested in my music, it's a mixture of funk, rap, little classic rock, and a little bit of jazz, and every once in a while I stumble upon a hook here and there. So appreciate you coming through. I also have 2 science fiction fantasy novels and a novella on Amazon. So thanks again, and I'll see you next episode.